January 1945. Snow drifts silently across the flat plains of Kansas, softening the edges of a nation still at war. Inside the barbed wire perimeter of Camp Concordia, a U.S. Army hospital hums with restrained urgency. The air smells of antiseptic and wet wool. Rows of iron beds stretch beneath low lights, their occupants wrapped in the gray stillness of defeat. One of them, a 24-year-old German corporal, stares at the ceiling. His arm is bound in white gauze. His eyes are tired, hollowed by months of combat and capture. Every sound, a footstep, a door creak, reminds him that he is far from home, deep in the land of his former enemy. A door opens. A young American nurse steps inside, her shoes whispering against the linoleum. She pauses by his bed, clipboard in hand, her face calm and unreadable. As she changes his dressing, he waits for contempt, maybe anger. Instead, her voice, quiet, professional, asks if he's in pain. He blinks, unsure how to answer. For the first time, the enemy doesn't hate him, and that quiet moment will change both their lives. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War was nearing its violent end. In Europe, Allied armies were pressing into the heart of Germany. American, British, and Canadian divisions advanced through ruined towns, capturing tens of thousands of soldiers with every mile. For the Third Reich, the dream of domination had collapsed into dust and surrender. But victory created a new problem: what to do with the captured enemy. By early 1945, the United States found itself responsible for more than 370,000 German prisoners of war on its soil. Ships crossed the Atlantic, carrying men who, months earlier, had fought fiercely against the Americans in France, Belgium, and Italy. They arrived in silence, soldiers stripped of weapons, insignia, and purpose. The U.S. government decided to house them in a network of over 500 camps spread across the nation. Most were built in quiet rural regions, far from cities: Kansas, Texas, Alabama, and Nebraska. The logic was simple. Farmland was plentiful, security easier to maintain, and local industries needed labor. What few civilians knew was that these camps were not harsh prisons. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, German POWs were entitled to fair treatment, food, medical care, and even pay for their work. For many Americans, this revelation was unsettling. They had lost sons and husbands in Europe. Yet here, the enemy was being fed and sheltered. Newspaper editorials debated the morality of kindness, but U.S. officials, mindful of American soldiers still held overseas, followed the law strictly. Each camp became a small, regimented world of its own. Watchtowers, fences, barracks, workshops, and, at the edge, the medical wards. In Kansas, the largest of these facilities stood outside a modest farming town, Camp Concordia, established in 1943. The complex stretched across 1,000 acres of prairie, housing nearly 4,000 German prisoners and several hundred American personnel. The men inside represented every branch of the Wehrmacht: infantrymen from Normandy, U-boat sailors, Luftwaffe mechanics. Some were ardent Nazis. Others were farmers' sons pulled unwillingly into the machinery of war. Conditions in these camps were, by wartime standards, humane. Prisoners received regular rations, medical attention, and limited freedom within the fences. They worked in nearby fields, repaired roads, and helped rebuild the American countryside while their homeland burned. For many, it was the first time they saw abundance: fresh bread, milk, even cigarettes, things that had long vanished from Germany. Yet the psychological burden remained. Letters home were censored and rare. News of bombings in Cologne, Hamburg, and Dresden arrived in fragmented whispers. At night, through the cold wind, men sang quiet songs of home. Lily Marleen, Ich hatte einen Kameraden, reminders of a country they might never see again. Medical care was one of the few moments when these German soldiers came face to face with American compassion. Army nurses, often in their early 20s, were assigned to treat prisoners just as they did American wounded. They followed strict discipline, no emotional contact, no sympathy beyond professional duty. But reality rarely obeyed regulations. The nurses saw not symbols of the enemy, but human beings. Thin, frightened, many barely older than themselves. And the prisoners, expecting punishment or neglect, found instead a quiet decency that unsettled them more than anger ever could. It was in this fragile space, between duty and empathy, that one such encounter would unfold. A German corporal, captured during the chaos of the Ardennes offensive, arrived at Camp Concordia's infirmary with shrapnel wounds in his arm and shoulder. His name, recorded in faded ink on the intake ledger, was Friedrich Müller, 24 years old, from Bremen. He had fought through Normandy, retreated through Belgium, and finally surrendered near the Meuse River in December 1944. To his comrades, the war had ended in humiliation. To Friedrich, it had ended in disbelief. Captured alive, shipped halfway across the world, and now lying in a clean American bed. He expected hostility. Instead, he found order, warmth, and the faint scent of coffee drifting down the hospital corridors. He didn't yet know the nurse assigned to his ward, a young woman from Iowa named Margaret Winters, daughter of a World War I veteran. To her, the war had taken her brother in the Pacific. She had every reason to hate the uniform on his back. And yet, when she first looked into his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not arrogance, not cruelty, but a weary, human fear. The war had brought them to opposite sides of the same wound, and inside that small Kansas hospital, their story was about to begin. The hospitals attached to America's POW camps were small worlds of their own, disciplined, quiet, and watched over by a military order that tolerated neither cruelty nor sentiment. Every morning began with the same ritual: the hum of generators, the clatter of breakfast trays, the sound of boots on polished floors. The wounded were inspected, their bandages changed, their fevers checked. The routine was meant to be impersonal, mechanical, a system to remind everyone, guard and prisoner alike, that even mercy in wartime had its rules. But beneath that surface, human moments broke through. At Camp Concordia, the infirmary was run by a handful of Army doctors, assisted by nurses from across the Midwest. Most had trained at small-town hospitals before volunteering for service. They worked 12-hour shifts, often treating both Americans and Germans in adjoining wards. To them, pain looked the same, no matter which language cried it out. Margaret Winters was 22 when she arrived at Concordia in late 1944. She had grown up in Des Moines, learned nursing from Catholic sisters, and joined the Army after her older brother, Thomas, was killed when his destroyer sank off Leyte Gulf. Her service, she believed, was a way to keep helping soldiers like him, to save lives in a world tearing itself apart. She had never seen a German up close before. In the newsreels, they were always shown as monsters, shouting, marching, faceless. But in the ward, they looked different. Thin men with hollow eyes, hands trembling when they reached for water. The first time she tended to one, he thanked her in broken English. The sound startled her. It was polite, even gentle. By regulation, nurses were ordered to maintain professional distance. They were warned that kindness could be misinterpreted. But Margaret, like many of her peers, found that compassion was part of the work. You couldn't heal without it. Friedrich Müller's case was routine by medical standards. Shrapnel embedded near the shoulder, infection spreading from an untreated wound. But for Margaret, he was unlike the others. He refused morphine, avoided eye contact, and barely spoke during her rounds. His silence wasn't defiance, it was shame. He knew he had fought for a cause that was collapsing. Margaret noticed the small details first. The way he stared at his hands, the precise way he folded the hospital blanket, the faint tremor in his voice when she said his name. Slowly, over the weeks, the wall between them began to crack. She brought him books from the camp library, Mark Twain, Jack London, stories of faraway rivers and restless men. He didn't understand every word, but he liked the sound of them. Outside the hospital fences, the war was reaching its final crescendo. In Europe, Allied bombers darkened the skies over Germany. News of the Ardennes counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had left America shaken but resolute. Then, by April 1945, came reports of liberated camps, Dachau, Buchenwald, revelations of horror that hardened many hearts against forgiveness. In that climate, kindness to German prisoners was seen by some as betrayal. Yet inside the infirmary, Margaret kept her quiet rhythm. She measured morphine doses, changed bandages, noted temperatures. Her compassion was practical, not ideological. The way a candle still gives light in a storm. Not because the darkness deserves it, but because that's what a candle does. The prisoners began to trust her. They greeted her with quiet, "Guten Morgen," and she answered, "Good morning." They learned each other's names, even laughed sometimes at the language mistakes. Friedrich started to speak more. A few words at first, then sentences. He told her about Bremen, about his mother's bakery, about the smell of yeast and coffee before the bombings. Margaret listened. For a few moments each day they forgot the fences, the uniforms, the war. It wasn't affection. Not yet. It was recognition. A realization that the faces they'd been told to hate were, in the end, only faces. By summer 1945, as Germany surrendered and the camp began preparing for repatriation, rumors spread through the POW community. Soon, they would be sent home. Some rejoiced. Others feared returning to ruins. For Friedrich, the thought filled him with both relief and sorrow. He wanted to see his family again. But leaving would mean parting from the one person who had treated him not as a number, but as a man. In the last pages of the medical logbook for Ward C, Margaret signed her name under his final entry. Wound healed. Fit for transfer. Neither of them knew that this was only the beginning of a longer journey, one that would test loyalty, compassion, and the fragile peace that followed the gun's silence. The war was over, but for them, something else had just begun. War is often remembered through the thunder of artillery and the clash of armies. Yet beneath the noise, history is shaped by quieter acts, gestures that never appear in battle reports. The story of a German prisoner and an American nurse can be understood through several lenses. Each reveals not just what happened, but why it mattered. To most Americans in 1945, the German uniform represented the face of evil. The newsreels from Europe, the bombed cities, the camps, the dead, left no room for sympathy. Yet when those same soldiers arrived in American camps, stripped of rank and weapon, the image began to blur. They were young, frightened, and hungry. Many were drafted boys who had never believed in Hitler's vision. Friedrich Müller was one of them. He had fought because he was told to, survived because he obeyed, and now lived because his captors chose mercy. When Margaret first cared for him, she did so out of duty, but the act itself carried meaning far beyond the hospital. Every bandage, every calm word was a quiet challenge to the hatred that war demanded. For Friedrich, her kindness was disarming. In his world, mercy was weakness. In hers, it was strength. Their daily exchanges, simple, procedural, became the first bridge between two broken nations. The human angle of their story is not about romance or sentiment. It is about the reawakening of trust between enemies. One whispered, "Thank you," at a time. The American Army Nurse Corps during World War II was one of the most disciplined and overworked units in the U.S. military. By 1945, more than 59,000 nurses served in field hospitals, hospital ships, and camps across the globe. They were trained not just to heal, but to endure. Long hours, scarce supplies, and the emotional toll of constant loss. In POW hospitals, the work was technical and tightly regulated. Each German patient was tagged by number. Every treatment logged in duplicate. Yet the nurses were expected to uphold the same medical standards for prisoners as for U.S. soldiers. That adherence to ethics, rooted in the Geneva Convention, became a defining moral stance of the American war effort. Margaret Winters embodied that principle. She had learned that discipline was compassion in its most resilient form. She never spoke of forgiveness. She simply practiced care. To clean a wound, to sterilize instruments, to lift a fevered head. These were not symbolic gestures, but acts of order amid chaos. To Friedrich, who had seen field hospitals on the Eastern Front, where the wounded were left to die, this level of care felt impossible. It forced him to question the very nature of the war he had fought. What kind of enemy heals you with her own hands? Medicine, in this context, became something larger than biology. It was a form of moral reconstruction, a test of whether humanity could survive after years of sanctioned brutality. Every time Margaret steadied his arm for an injection, she was, unknowingly, rebuilding a fragment of his faith in mankind. While their story unfolded quietly inside Camp Concordia, the global war machine continued to turn. The U.S. War Department viewed POW management as both a logistical challenge and a psychological opportunity. Well-treated prisoners were expected to return to Germany as voices of moderation, living proof that the United States fought with principle, not vengeance. This policy was deliberate. The Office of the Provost Marshal General had studied how mistreatment of POWs in World War I had fueled resentment and future conflict. In 1944, Washington ordered that German prisoners should experience the fairness of American law. The hope was that when they went home, they would carry those impressions back into the ruins of post-war Germany. Margaret and Friedrich never knew it, but their daily interactions were part of that larger strategic vision. Every compassionate act within a POW hospital was quietly political. It served the broader goal of reshaping the minds of the defeated, to teach by example that dignity could survive defeat. This hearts and minds policy became one of the first experiments in psychological post-war reconstruction, a precursor to what would later be known as nation-building. And it began not in diplomatic chambers, but in places like Ward C, where a nurse's patience became an extension of national strategy. War compresses time. Weeks can feel like years. In the stillness of the infirmary, the days passed with rhythmic repetition. Temperature checks, medication rounds, silence. Slowly, those small moments accumulated into something deeper. Friedrich's guarded politeness became curiosity. Margaret's professional distance softened into understanding. The first time he smiled, it was faint, uncertain, when she mispronounced a German word. The first time she smiled back, it was instinctive. These were fragile exchanges, invisible to the outside world, yet monumental for two people who had learned to see each other as symbols, not souls. Neither spoke of friendship. The rules forbade it. Yet, in the unspoken space between words, something gentler took root. Not attraction, but recognition of shared humanity. They were both, in their own way, survivors. For Friedrich, that realization was disorienting. He had been trained to believe Americans were brutal conquerors. Now, the woman who handed him medicine reminded him of his sister. For Margaret, the change was subtler. The quiet understanding that compassion does not betray the dead. It honors them. By the time he was well enough to leave the ward, neither could look at the other without a sense of loss. Their brief connection had become a mirror, showing them who they were before war told them otherwise. And beyond the wire fences, the summer sun of 1945 was rising over a world struggling to rediscover its conscience. The moral paradox of war is that it demands both cruelty and conscience. Soldiers are taught to fight without hesitation, yet civilizations justify that fighting only by claiming moral superiority. The American handling of German POWs was one of those paradoxes made visible. Across the United States, some civilians protested the generous treatment given to captured Germans. Newspapers ran letters questioning why enemy soldiers received meat, milk, and clean beds when many Americans faced rationing. Yet military officials argued that decency toward prisoners was not sentimentality. It was a statement of national identity. For Margaret Winters, morality was not debated in policy meetings. It was practiced in silence. Every time she entered the ward, she faced the contradiction of caring for a man whose comrades had killed her brother's friends in Europe. Some nights, when she sat by the window after her shift, she questioned whether kindness diluted justice. But when she remembered the look in Friedrich's eyes, the same hollow fatigue she had seen in dying American boys, she understood that compassion did not erase the past. It simply refused to continue its cruelty. For Friedrich, morality was equally complicated. He had once believed obedience was virtue, that following orders was honor. Now, as he recovered under the care of an enemy nurse, he began to suspect that true morality might lie in the courage to see others as human. It was a revelation forged not through ideology, but through experience, the kind that leaves a scar you carry forever. Outside the camp fences, Kansas life went on. Farmers plowed the fields, children played by the river, and the distant echo of the war reached them only through newspapers and telegrams. The presence of German prisoners in their midst stirred curiosity and unease. Local newspapers described the POWs as polite and industrious, noting how they labored in wheat fields and repaired barns. Some townspeople brought food to the camps, others kept their distance. Rumors spread that the prisoners were treated too well, that they ate white bread while American families endured shortages. When the army nurses walked into town in uniform, they were often greeted with gratitude and admiration, but whispers followed them too, questions about what they did for the Germans. Margaret learned quickly to stay silent outside the wire. Compassion, she discovered, was safer when unseen. The war had taught people to divide the world neatly: heroes and villains, victors and defeated. Yet the camps blurred those lines. Some prisoners sent hand-carved toys to local children. Others wrote thank-you letters to American guards when they were repatriated. A quiet exchange of humanity took place beneath the notice of history. In time, some communities would look back with pride on how they treated their captives. Others would remember only discomfort. But for Margaret and Friedrich, society's gaze was the invisible wall between them, more impenetrable than barbed wire. War alters not just landscapes, but minds. Psychologists who later studied the POW experience found that captivity can dismantle a man's identity as completely as combat. For Friedrich, captivity was not merely imprisonment, it was disorientation. The authority that had defined his purpose was gone. His uniform no longer meant anything. In the hospital, he began to reconstruct himself, slowly, through routine and interaction. The nurse's patience became his mirror, reflecting a version of himself not defined by propaganda. He began to recall his pre-war life, helping in his mother's bakery, reading travel magazines, dreaming of studying engineering. These memories, suppressed during the years of war, now returned like thawing ground after frost. For Margaret, the transformation was subtler, but no less profound. She had joined the army to fight despair, to keep herself from collapsing under grief for her brother. But working with the prisoners forced her to confront another truth: that empathy was not weakness, but endurance. Each day she managed to show grace to someone who once bore her enemy's insignia. She reclaimed a small part of her own faith in humanity. This mutual reconstruction was never spoken aloud. It existed in gestures, A shared glance, a word of thanks, the absence of hostility. When Friedrich's wounds finally closed and his strength returned, Margaret noted it with professional pride. But part of her feared what came next. Healing meant departure, and departure meant silence. The story of Margaret and Friedrich was not unique. Between 1943 and 1946, over 425,000 German prisoners lived in camps across the United States. Among them, thousands worked on American farms, factories, and roads. Many developed respectful, even friendly, relationships with guards and civilians. Archival letters and oral histories tell of American women who corresponded with former prisoners after their repatriation. Some of those correspondences turned into marriages, defying both wartime prejudice and bureaucratic resistance. A few, like Margaret and Friedrich's, endured decades, becoming symbols of reconciliation. These stories were often hidden from public view. In the immediate post-war years, America's attention turned to rebuilding Europe and confronting the realities of the Holocaust. The idea of a German-American marriage was, to many, unsettling. Too soon, too raw. Yet these quiet unions became part of a broader historical truth. Peace is not signed in ink, but in the way people choose to treat one another after the fighting stops. Friedrich's file in the Camp Concordia archive would later note his repatriation in late 1945. Margaret's service record listed her transfer to an army hospital in Topeka. Officially, their stories ended there. But history, like memory, does not always follow official lines. By the summer of 1945, the war was over. Germany lay in ruins, divided and starving. The United States, victorious yet weary, turned its attention homeward. In the camps, the prisoners packed their few belongings, ready to board trains eastward. For most, it was an ending. For one German soldier and one American nurse, it was a beginning disguised as farewell. The summer heat of 1945 pressed down on the plains of Kansas. The barbed wire fences shimmered in the distance, and inside Camp Concordia, routine had turned to waiting. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered in May. In the infirmary, men once branded as enemies now listened for the faint rumors of home. Rumors carried in Red Cross bulletins and letters written in uncertain English. For Friedrich Müller, recovery was nearly complete. His shoulder had healed, leaving a thin scar like a pale lightning strike across his skin. He could lift his arm again, though the muscles ached. The doctors signed his release from the hospital, marking him as fit for labor. In a few weeks, he would join the work detachments harvesting wheat in the Kansas fields. Margaret Winters watched him walk for the first time without a sling. He moved stiffly, but with determination. She said nothing, only recorded his progress in the chart. Rules were rules. Nurses were to remain professional at all times. No unnecessary conversation. But in her handwriting, there was a tremor she hadn't noticed before. Their days had fallen into rhythm. The morning inspection, the quiet exchange of greetings, the brief, unspoken gratitude in his eyes when she handed him medicine. Each time, she told herself, it would be the last. Each time, something pulled her back. The simple human need to see someone through to the end of their healing. Outside the ward, the world was changing. In August, news arrived that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Japan. Then another. For many at Camp Concordia, it was the final punctuation mark to a war that had consumed everything. Guards and prisoners alike gathered around the camp's radio, listening in stunned silence as the announcer declared that the fighting was finished. The men cheered, but the cheer was hollow. For Friedrich, the words brought only uncertainty. The Reich was gone. His home city, Bremen, had been bombed into ashes. His father's letters had stopped months ago. He didn't know who or what was left to return to. That evening, he found himself sitting on the edge of the infirmary cot, staring at the sunset bleeding across the prairie. Margaret was finishing her rounds when she saw him there, lost in thought. She paused, clipboard in hand. "You'll be leaving soon," she said quietly. He looked up, uncertain whether to respond. Then, in careful English, "Yes, but I don't know where I go." She hesitated, then sat on the empty cot beside him. A small breach of military protocol. "Home," she said softly. "You'll go home." He shook his head. "No home." The words hung between them, heavy and plain. Margaret wanted to say something, but there was nothing that fit. She could not promise him a life after ruin. So she did what she knew. She checked the dressing. On his arm one last time, rewrapped it with quiet precision, and said, "Then maybe you'll build one." For a long moment, neither spoke. The light faded, and the room filled with the steady hum of cicadas from beyond the window screens. When Friedrich was reassigned to the labor detachment, she watched him leave through the hospital door, head shaved, uniform neatly pressed, walking in formation with a dozen others. He turned once, briefly, and she raised a hand. He returned the gesture, then disappeared behind the trucks that would carry them to the fields. In the following weeks, Camp Concordia began to empty. Trainloads of prisoners departed for ports in the east, bound for Europe. The fences that had once seemed permanent now looked temporary, rusting under the prairie sun. The war's architecture of captivity was dismantling itself. One morning in November 1945, the order came for the last group of prisoners to prepare for repatriation. Friedrich's name was on the list. Before leaving, he managed to send a short letter through the Red Cross to the infirmary. "To Nurse Winters, thank you for your kindness. I will not forget. Maybe one day I can say this in person, not as a prisoner." Friedrich Müller. It was unsigned by regulation, censored for content, and delivered weeks later. Margaret kept it folded inside her medical notebook. She never told anyone about it. In December, the final trains left Camp Concordia. The barracks went silent. The nurses were reassigned to new hospitals. The guards returned to civilian life. Margaret's orders sent her to Topeka, where she worked with wounded veterans returning from the Pacific. But sometimes, when she passed the railway station and heard the distant echo of a departing whistle, she thought of the young man with the scar on his shoulder and the quiet dignity in his eyes. Thousands of miles away, on the ruined docks of Bremerhaven, Friedrich stepped off the ship into a Germany he barely recognized. The harbor was filled with wrecks, the skyline hollowed by war. Refugees crowded the streets, scavenging for food and coal. Yet, amid the devastation, he felt something strange. The faint resilience of survival. He found his mother in Bremen, living in a basement with neighbors. She cried when she saw him. He told her nothing about the American nurse. Only once, he had been treated with kindness far from home. In the years that followed, he rebuilt his life, brick by brick. But the memory of that kindness stayed, not as romance, but as proof that even in defeat, a man could still be seen as human. And though neither of them knew it yet, fate was not finished with their story. The war's end did not bring peace easily. For Europe, it was a season of ghosts, cities hollowed by fire, families divided by occupation zones, and men like Friedrich Müller wandering through ruins that no longer felt like home. The first post-war winters were the hardest. Germany's infrastructure had collapsed. Food was scarce, currency worthless, and every street bore the scars of bomb craters and lost years. Friedrich worked as a laborer, clearing debris, then as an apprentice machinist in a factory under British supervision. The Americans were gone, but their presence lingered in memory, in the way the rations were distributed fairly, in the order that contrasted sharply with Germany's chaos. Among the rubble and hunger, something else persisted, a name he could not forget. Winters. He didn't know her first name. The Red Cross had censored it, but he remembered her face with photographic clarity. Calm eyes, steady hands, the quiet assurance that had felt more powerful than any command. In early 1947, a Red Cross representative visited the factory, collecting testimonies from returning POWs. They were invited to write to American sponsors or families they had known during captivity, part of a goodwill exchange. Friedrich hesitated for days before he wrote. The letter was simple, almost awkward in its English. To the nurse from Concordia, Kansas, you once cared for a German soldier with a bad arm. I am alive and home in Bremen. I hope you are well. Friedrich. He handed it over, unsure if it would ever reach her. It did. Months later, in a modest apartment in Topeka, Kansas, Margaret found an envelope bearing foreign stamps and careful handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The words were brief, almost formal, but behind them she felt the same quiet sincerity that had marked every glance across the hospital ward. For weeks, she said nothing to anyone. She reread the letter late at night, beneath the weak light of a single lamp. The war had ended, but the emotional debris remained. Grief for her brother, the exhaustion of years of loss, and now this unexpected message from someone she thought lost to history. In early 1948, she wrote back, Dear Friedrich, I remember you. I'm glad you're safe. Kansas is quiet again. The hospital has closed. I hope your country finds peace soon. Her letter, too, passed through layers of censorship and bureaucracy before it reached him. When it did, Friedrich stood in the cold light of his workshop, reading her handwriting. Neat, deliberate, unmistakably hers. Their correspondence continued, cautiously at first. They wrote of small things, weather, work, books, the slow rebuilding of cities. The letters grew longer, warmer. He told her about his mother's health, about helping rebuild the local bridge. She told him about the veterans she now cared for, about how sometimes she still dreamed of the ward in Concordia. The smell of disinfectant and snow. By 1949, post-war Germany had changed. The U.S. occupation gave way to the birth of the Federal Republic. Aid flowed through the Marshall Plan, factories restarted, and the first signs of recovery appeared. For Friedrich, hope returned in cautious increments. The sound of machinery, the laughter of children, the arrival of letters from across the Atlantic. Each letter from Margaret felt like sunlight through gray clouds. For both, the exchange became an anchor, proof that decency had survived the wreckage. In 1950, Friedrich applied for a visa through a new exchange program for former POWs who had demonstrated cooperation and good conduct. The process was slow, buried in red tape, but he persisted. He wanted to thank her in person, to see if the connection that had once existed between two strangers in a hospital ward could exist again in a world at peace. It took 2 years of petitions and sponsorship letters. Finally, in the spring of 1952, permission was granted. Margaret was waiting at the train station in Topeka when the visitor from Germany arrived. Older, leaner, his hair threaded with gray. When he stepped off the platform, she recognized his gait before she saw his face. For a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the arriving train filled the space between them. Then he said, quietly, "You remembered." "I never forgot," she answered. It was not the dramatic reunion of a love story. It was simple, restrained, and profoundly human. Two people acknowledging the improbable fact that kindness once shared in war could outlast the war itself. They spent days talking about the hospital, about what the years had done to them. He told her that her care had changed the way he saw the world, that he had joined a local church group rebuilding schools for orphans because of what she had shown him about mercy. She told him that his letters had reminded her not all uniformed men were the same. That empathy was the only real victory to come out of the conflict. By the end of that summer, they were married in a small chapel surrounded by friends and veterans. There was no grandeur, only sincerity. She wore a simple blue dress. He wore a borrowed suit. When the minister asked how they had met, Margaret smiled and said, "In the war." But that's not how we remember it. Photographs from that day show them standing side by side, both looking slightly uncertain, as if still surprised that the world had allowed them this peace. In the years that followed, their story spread quietly, first among friends, then among local papers. It became a small symbol of reconciliation. The German soldier and the American nurse who met behind barbed wire, proving that humanity can survive even when everything else collapses. And in every telling, the same truth remained. The war had ended in violence, but their story had begun in an act of grace. Their marriage, like the new world forming around them, was built on fragile hope and quiet defiance. In 1952, a German man marrying an American woman was still an uncommon event, shadowed by suspicion and memory. The scars of war ran deep, not just in nations, but in neighbors. When Margaret and Friedrich settled in Kansas, they faced questions that were never openly voiced, but always implied. Some townsfolk looked at Friedrich with polite curiosity, others with unease. A few refused to speak to him altogether. To many Americans, Germany was still a wound, not yet healed. Yet the couple's calm dignity disarmed hostility. They worked hard, paid their bills, and kept to themselves. Friedrich found employment at a machine workshop in Wichita, his hands skilled from years of rebuilding engines in Bremen. Margaret continued her nursing at the local hospital, respected for her quiet discipline and the calm she carried into every room. At home, they built a small life, a modest house, a garden, and a routine defined by simplicity rather than comfort. Their marriage was less a romance than a shared understanding. Both had seen too much to expect perfection. What they wanted was steadiness, the peace they had been denied in youth. In private moments, they spoke of the past sparingly. He never glorified the army. She never spoke of the wounded men who hadn't survived her care. Yet, between them existed a deep recognition, the unspoken knowledge that both had been shaped by the same storm, and both had chosen, consciously, not to let it define them. The American press, hungry for stories of redemption in the 1950s, discovered them by accident. A local reporter, researching the history of Camp Concordia, learned of their meeting and marriage. The article, titled "From Enemy Lines to Wedding Vows," appeared in a small-town newspaper. It described their story in gentle tones, not sensational but curious. "Love knows no flag," it read, "only the shared humanity of those who remember compassion when others forget." The story spread quietly. Letters arrived from across the country, some congratulatory, some angry. Veterans groups debated it. Church congregations discussed it from pulpits. For some, it symbolized forgiveness. For others, it felt like betrayal. Symbolized forgiveness. For others, it felt like betrayal. But to Margaret and Friedrich, it was neither. They had never sought to make a statement. Their union was simply the continuation of a moment that had begun with a bandage in a Kansas infirmary years before. By 1955, they had their first child, a daughter they named Anna. She grew up bilingual, hearing lullabies in both English and German, unaware that her parents' accents carried the weight of continents once at war. At her school, some teachers asked about her father's past. Margaret would answer simply, "He was a soldier. Now he's a husband and a father. That's all that matters." Their story mirrored a quiet transformation taking place across both nations. The United States and West Germany were becoming allies. American aid rebuilt German cities. German scientists and engineers contributed to U.S. technology. The Cold War had rearranged loyalties, and yesterday's enemy had become today's partner. In that shifting landscape, the Müllers' life, half German, half American, became almost prophetic. They embodied what governments would later call reconciliation, though to them it was just living. In the evenings, Friedrich sometimes sat on the porch, watching the Kansas sky fade into orange and violet, the same horizon he had once seen through barbed wire. He would say little, but every so often he would squeeze Margaret's hand and murmur, "Strange, how peace feels." She would smile, her eyes soft with memory. "It's quieter than I expected," she'd reply. Their story, once born in a time of division, had become part of the world's slow reconstruction. One small, steady act of defiance against the hatred that nearly destroyed everything. As the years turned into decades, the story of Friedrich and Margaret Müller faded from public attention, but not from local memory. In the small Kansas town where they built their life, they became known simply as the couple from the camp. For younger generations, the phrase carried no bitterness. It was said with quiet admiration. By the 1960s, the United States had moved on to new conflicts and new fears. The old wounds of World War II were slowly being replaced by Cold War anxieties and the turmoil of Vietnam. Yet, in their home, the past still lived in the framed photographs. One of Friedrich in a faded Wehrmacht uniform, another of Margaret in her nurse's whites, both reminders of a time that had nearly erased them. When visitors came, students, journalists, historians, they often asked the same question: "How could you forgive?" Margaret would answer first, her voice calm but firm. "It wasn't about forgiving," she would say. "It was about seeing. Once you see a man bleeding the same way as your own brother, you stop caring about flags." Friedrich's reply was simpler. "She treated me like a man, not an enemy." That was enough. They rarely discussed politics or ideology. Their home was a place of work, family, and quiet conviction. They believed that history was best changed not by grand speeches, but by the ordinary kindness of daily life, a principle they lived by and taught to their children. By the 1970s, their daughter Anna had become a teacher. She told her students the story of her parents not as a tale of romance, but as one of responsibility. "War," she would say, "doesn't end when the shooting stops. It ends when people choose to see each other again." Friedrich never returned to Germany permanently. He visited Bremen once, in 1975, to see his surviving relatives. The city had changed, modern, rebuilt, yet filled with echoes. Standing by the Weser River, he said it felt both familiar and foreign. "I am German," he told a cousin, "but America is where my life began again." In Kansas, Margaret's health began to falter by the 1980s. Years of hospital work had worn her down, and she moved more slowly, her hands trembling slightly when she poured tea. Friedrich took over the household duties without complaint, tending to her with the same quiet care she had once shown him. In the winter of 1986, after 34 years of marriage, she passed away in her sleep. Her funeral was held in the same small church where they had been married. Veterans, townsfolk, and even a few former prisoners of war who had remained in the U.S. came to pay their respects. Friedrich stood beside her coffin in silence. When the minister spoke of her service and her compassion, he nodded once, the only acknowledgement he could manage. "She healed many men," the minister said, "but she also healed one war." For years after her death, Friedrich continued to live quietly in the same house. He volunteered at the local hospital, fixing small machines, delivering supplies. Some days he visited schools, bringing with him an old photograph of Camp Concordia. He would tell the students in careful English, "This is where my war ended, and where something better began." He died in 1994, aged 73. The local Seisis paper ran a short obituary. Friedrich Müller, former German prisoner of war and longtime resident of Kansas, passed away peacefully, survived by his daughter, Anna, and 2 grandchildren. Known for his kindness and for reminding us that compassion can outlast conflict. When Anna went through her parents' belongings, she found the letters they had written during the late 1940s, dozens of them, tied neatly in a faded ribbon. The first one, his hesitant English greeting; the last, her promise to meet him at the train station. She donated them, along with her parents' photographs, to the Camp Concordia POW Museum, where they remain today. Visitors still stop before the glass case, reading the words of 2 people who met across the sharpest divide of their time. The story of the German prisoner and the American nurse has since been included in local history exhibits, documentaries, and university lectures about post-war reconciliation. But the essence of it remains unchanged, a testament to the quiet strength of mercy, to the humanity that endures even when nations forget it. And though the wind still sweeps across the Kansas plains, rattling the grass that grows over the old camp's foundations, their story remains, not carved in stone, but alive in the hearts of those who read it and understand that kindness, once given, never truly disappears. Theirs was not a fairy tale. It was something rarer, a true story that proved love could survive war, not because it was stronger than hate, but because it refused to speak its language. History often remembers the loudest moments, the thunder of artillery, the roar of speeches, the crumbling of empires. Yet it is the quiet acts, almost invisible in their time, that shape what follows. The story of Friedrich and Margaret Müller was one such act, a whisper of humanity in an age defined by noise. In the ruins of World War II, the world demanded justice, vengeance, and rebuilding. But somewhere between those vast imperatives lay the smaller, essential work of healing. Margaret's simple decision to treat an enemy soldier not with hatred, but with care, was not written into treaties or textbooks, yet its consequences rippled across generations. Her kindness reminded that the Geneva Convention was more than paper. It was a test of conscience. And Friedrich's response, the courage to accept compassion from those who had every reason to despise him, proved that reconciliation begins not with governments, but with individuals. Their story speaks to the strange resilience of the human heart. 2 people divided by language, ideology, and grief met in a moment stripped of all pretense. One wounded, one healing. From that moment came a marriage, a family, and a quiet. Proof that even in the ashes of history, decency can rebuild what hatred destroys. Today, Camp Concordia stands mostly empty. The guard towers are gone, the barracks are quiet. Grass grows where soldiers once marched. Yet in its silence, it holds something enduring. The memory that in the heart of a war, built on dehumanization, humanity somehow endured. Visitors who walk those grounds may not know every name, but they can feel what remains. The fragile line between duty and compassion, between survival and mercy. Friedrich and Margaret's story is not grand. It has no medals, no monuments, no military triumphs, but in a century defined by conflict, their lives offered a different kind of victory. The victory of empathy over fear, of seeing the human being where once there was only the enemy. And that, perhaps, is the quiet truth of all wars. That Peace is not signed at tables, but found in moments, when one person chooses to care for another, even when the world says they should not.